Good morning, class. I want to check in with you briefly and make some comments that I didn't quite get to in class. And I'm going to start here by reminding you of our objective today, where we focused almost all of our attention, with the exception of spending a little time with a few questions about your web quest on the ancient Harappan or Indus River Valley civilizations. We spent most of our time today looking at early China, and in class I made the comment that when we're talking about ancient civilization in China, there's actually a lot to discuss, and you'll appreciate that more as we proceed through the quarter. But we're really, again, looking at ancient Chinese civilization 1.0, and so we don't really get too deep of a sliver here. In fact, many of the things that we'll cover today in class, looking at China, are early efforts that almost don't even reach the definition of what historians think of when they use a term like civilization. And of course, you are all becoming very well attuned to this because you know your 7 characteristics of civilization, and you can apply them a little bit and determine to what degree a given civilization, or I should say a given society, meets the benchmarks of civilization. So we spent a little time in class today talking about the primary document that I assigned for our meeting today, and that was by Mencius, and I mentioned that he was writing in the 3rd or 4th century BCE, but he was writing about events that were several centuries before that time, and he was writing through a lens that was of his mentor Confucius, a earlier Chinese scholar and teacher for whom Mencius had tremendous respect. I had hoped to pivot from that conversation to start talking about some of the earliest societies and civilizations to emerge in China, but we ran out of time. This map is useful to us in the sense that it shows that when we talk about early Chinese civilization, we can simplify it a little bit by thinking of there being a northern civilization hearth that was centered upon the Yellow River. And if you squint a little more closely, you can see the Yellow River behind this, underlying this map. And then farther south along the Yangtze River. And this is the Shandong region of China, and that of course is going to be home to one of the hearths of development. Because I have the map, I'll just briefly note that the early agricultural developments in the north were centered around millet, an important and nutritious grain, while the agricultural surplus and prosperity of the south was largely based upon rice and the domestication of that important grain. And so taken together, we'll have 2 close but not identical civilizational hearths that emerge. Also want to point out there's quite a bit of geographic barrier that served to separate early Chinese civilizations, not completely, but separated them nonetheless rather significantly from the rest of the civilizations taking shape on Eurasia. And the Gobi Desert would be an important part of that, the Taklamakan Desert, and then the mountains, the Himalayas over here that are just off the map. These all serve as noteworthy geographical barriers that, for better and for worse, impact the development of ancient China. So when we talk about ancient China, particularly your textbook in chapter 2, it's talking about really 2 early societies that helped develop some of the early building blocks of later Chinese civilization. And the first is the Yangshao, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. And what I want to point out is that in my comments today, we're really looking at a China that does not have all of the benefits or advantages that some of its counterparts in different areas of the world, like in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Indus River Valley. China is going to proceed and get a little bit of a slower start on its path towards civilization, partly because the earliest societies and villages that form in China do so without the benefit of hydraulic projects like dams or irrigation projects. We don't see much in the way of urban city settlements. Things tend to be dispersed into sort of more rural villages. And because of that, there isn't going to be a very powerful or developed governmental presence. Bureaucrats and educated scribes and writers, there's not going to be quite as much of that. So part of this will explain why later on, when China does finally incorporate these critical aspects of civilization, it's going to take a rather dramatic turn towards civilization, and helps explain why we talk about Chinese civilization as being something that's lasted something around 4,000 years, a very long time. I already spoke about the geographic barriers. It's also worth noting that China, because of some of those geographic barriers, it lasts a longer time. It goes a longer time in ancient world history before it has all the advantages and benefits of the domesticated animals in places farther west in Eurasia. So those geographic barriers sort of slow or trickle the flow of possibly beneficial some of the advantages that might have come more easily had it not been relatively sheltered by its geography. So historians talk first about the Yangshao period, which is from roughly 4000 BCE to 3000 BCE. And we see some evidence there, although, as I've already mentioned, not terribly sophisticated evidence, not dramatic agricultural breakthroughs, not much in the way of urban settlements. And another aspect that makes it really interesting to think about the Yangshao period is that most of our sources, many of our sources, are oral histories that come from people sort of like Mencius. And I mentioned in class today that Mencius was not so much a historian that concerned himself with getting events right, so much as spinning a moral tale that could serve to influence and guide the present generations of Chinese society. And we talked about the power of history and how it can sometimes be difficult to compete with history, because when history becomes idealized and it tells us things like the greatest generation or the wisdom and genius of our founding fathers and their generation, sometimes we gloss over some of the problems and challenges and moral failings of people in the past, and we just dwell upon how great they were, and therefore perhaps run the risk of making our present generation feel inadequate, either morally or in the form of courage or in the form of valor on the battlefield, say. So one of the best explanations for how China and the Yangshao societies do connect and receive some of the benefits of civilizations farther to their west is through the presence of those pastoral nomads who we mentioned a little bit late last week, and who will continue to play a role as sort of the connective tissue that unites different civilizations and shares some of the findings of one civilization to the next. So the Yangshao doesn't give us a whole lot to go on. But if we fast forward to 3000 BCE and continue to about 2000 BCE, which is kind of the end point or bookend of chapter 2, we'll start to see that by the latter half, during the 3rd millennium BCE, we do start to see China make some important steps, and we can see this particularly evident during the Longshan period. And oddly enough, each of these periods really derives its name from the type of pottery that is common and found throughout the civilizational hearths of China during this time. Some of the steps and strides that we see evident are, again, the pottery. We see some of these villages turning closer to something of population densities that we might start to think of as cities. Cemetery, so there's a ceremony and ritual of honoring the dead. Keep an eye on that because that's going to be important as we look at some of the cultural practices of East Asia and China. Veneration of ancestors will be a very important element of that. Pardon me. We see jade and other sort of precious stones and gems that become an important part of the ceremony. Jade appears to be a valuable commodity that is a way of showing honor and showing respect and showing status within a society. We also start to see during the Longshan efforts to protect and stabilize and secure some of these early population centers, which of course are integral to the ultimate formation of civilization. There is some interregional contact. As I mentioned, we see aspects of this pottery, and we find things like jade scattered over a fairly large geographic area, which suggests to us that there was trade, there was a shared influence. The fact that many of these villages and early cities seem to share some common interests in trade goods, that suggests that there was something of a contact that is taking place. We don't have anything that's going to be a significant political organization, but we do start to see some important steps along that path. And when we start looking at China in Chapter 3, we'll see more evidence of it coming together. But during this Longshan era, there are advances in agriculture and the domestication of plants and animals. And we also start to see this last bullet, which is tough for you to see, cosmology across rituals. It means that there starts to be a common system of meaning that various villages and cities throughout China start to embrace. Certainly are not all going to be one and the same, but we start to see some shared and some common practices and belief systems. And so all of this is giving us a sense of the early coming together of Chinese civilization and society. In closing, what I will say is that toward the end of this Longshan period, and I mentioned this in class earlier today in the context of the Indus River Valley civilizations, we start to see some climate stresses, some climate instability and change, a drying of this region. So the Yellow River, Yangtze River, oftentimes environmental stress can serve to drive a society's turn toward agriculture, right? Again, that all-important issue of security, trying to take matters into your own hands. As the climate changes, it's quite possible that the hunting and gathering and other subsistence practices are no longer going to be as viable. So we start to see China during the third millennium, particularly toward the end of it, pushing ever more intensely toward what other civilizations have already done in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus River Valley. These are some of the early signs that are driving China closer towards civilization. The establishment of trade networks, which helps us understand when we see pottery, common pottery, we see jade, we see evidence of ritual that starts to look like ritual over there is also over here. All these things suggest that there's a certain coming together. And I want to close by just saying that remember the significance of an idealized history in China. It's not so much important to get history correct. It's important to get history and to tell the story of the past in a way that gives inspiration and a sense of duty for generations of the present to conduct themselves in a way that will continue to drive forward and drive toward greater virtue people in the present. So thank you.